Greetings, unique visitors. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. I think you've picked a great day to join us on our program. Later on, a lot of you know this because you send the tweets to me. I love the work of Bud Elliott now with 24/7 Sports, the blue chip ratio, looking at the percentage of former 4- and 5-star guys on a roster and how that potentially predicts who can and can't win a national championship. I read it every year. Also look forward to having Bud Elliott. We'll usually bring him on the show about once a year, so we actually brought him on during earlier in the spring. So this is, I guess, a little bit more than that. But Bud's going to be on the show today. This is a really good interview. We've actually already recorded it. Talking about Georgia, talking about the rest of the SEC, and just the challenge that awaits Georgia, knowing that it builds its roster up. Still got some work to be done in terms of toppling the other elite programs in the country. Very candid comments from Bud Elliott on that from 24/7 Sports here today. He was good enough to be with us, and we'll have that for you later on. I'm also going to begin the show with one of my favorite topics. Georgia wide receiver George Pickens. Obviously, we loved the freshman season that Pickens put together last year. There are a couple of things, though, and a lot of this plays off of something ESPN has written about Pickens, but there are a couple of things about Pickens that need to be said. One that we've said before many times, but I think it needs to be repeated today. Something else, though, kind of a fun, possibility about what might be in store here for 2020. We'll do a lot of that, all of it, in fact, next. Really good to have you with us as DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Merriweather and Tharp, begins right now.
Is brought to you by Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Feel the need to apologize off the top of the show today because I'm about to say something that, for those of you that watch or listen every single day to DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp, you've heard me say before. But, as I often say, leaders are repeaters, and occasionally there is a thing that needs to be said more than once. And today, the thing that I will repeat again that I've said before is that there's a certain aspect to George Pickens' story that doesn't bother me nearly as much as it seems to bother some other people. Or maybe bother's the wrong word. Maybe bother's too strong of a word. Let's use the word concern instead. There's a certain concern that seems to exist for George Pickens, the Georgia wide receiver who had a sensational freshman season, getting ready to go into a second season, that has never been as much of a concern for me as it is for others. Let me give you an example of that. I like when ESPN does its off-season content. A lot more of this is behind a paywall than it used to be. I guess they got some Disney Plus subscriptions to sell. But one way or another, ESPN putting out its list of most exciting players for each of its top 25 teams. Connor Riley's actually got a good piece up there on DawgNation.com about this as well. But as you might expect, just given the rest of the preseason chatter that's kind of out there, the most exciting player on the Georgia roster, at least as thought of before the start of the season, is sophomore wide receiver George Pickens. Alex Scarborough is the writer here. Let me read to you from what he wrote at ESPN.com, and you can read the entire story for yourself. We'll put a link to that when we post the show a little later on. Scarborough says of Pickens, he's the guy that defensive coordinators already fear if he can steer clear of trouble. He's a big play threat from anywhere on the field. Now, nobody denies the last part of that. George Pickens is clearly a big play threat from anywhere. We've obviously seen that, especially later on in the year as he got more accustomed to big-time college football, more accustomed to what was going on at UGA. He just thrived. And by the way, quick aside here, this is for free. We have seen the last couple of years a couple of truly great freshman seasons. Some of the Alabama guys, Jerry Jeudy probably had one of those, Justin Ross for Clemson a couple of years ago. I think, though, it's important to note that the outliers here are not indicative of the larger story. That if you look at the overwhelming number of freshman receivers in big-time college football, this is still a position that's kind of tough to play as a freshman. Look at Jamar Chase, last year's Biletnikoff Award winner as a sophomore. Go back and compare what he did as a freshman. That's a little bit more, I think, in line with what we typically expect from freshmen. So Pickens, he may not have been as good as a freshman as, say, Ross was for Clemson a couple years ago, or maybe Jeudy was for Alabama in 2017. But the truth is, in terms of actual performances from the typical freshman at the SEC level, the major college level, George Pickens' freshman season was truly sensational, and it only sets him up for more success in year two. So let me just make sure I say that. But as far as the other part of what Alex Scarborough points out, and I don't believe that Alex is wrong for mentioning this because it comes up with George Pickens a lot. The notion of the thing that potentially gets in Pickens' way, the thing that potentially holds him back from the success that would seem to be his birthright is steering clear of trouble, being careful not to get kind of drawn off sides, both literally and figuratively, I guess. And we all saw this with our own eyes. Pickens had missed the first half of the Georgia Tech game, came in the second half of the Georgia Tech game, got in a squabble with a Tech player, ended up being suspended in the first half of the SEC championship game. We saw this play out. And we also saw seemingly George Pickens overcome all of that, had terrific performance against Baylor in the Sugar Bowl, and yet when Pickens was honored after the game as the game's best player in the Sugar Bowl, even in the conversation that went on in that post-game press conference, Pickens sitting up there on the platform for the first time all season long, speaking to reporters for the first time all season long, there was a little bit of anxiety in the room about, everything that George had overcome during the year, everything that George had kind of dealt with during the season. This is not fully articulated, but the feeling is clearly there. Let me give you an example. Here is reporter's question, Pickens' answer on the topic of how are you different now after the Sugar Bowl from maybe kind of, where you were at one point in time? Do you feel like you've grown at Georgia? And listen to the interjection that Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm gives you here. Listen to the interjection that Kirby Smart gives you here. If Alex Scarborough says that Pickens got to be careful steering clear of trouble, certainly that point was seemingly also articulated by some of the mood in the post-game press conference after the Sugar Bowl. Here is an example of that.
George, do you think that you've grown up over the last 4 months and even...
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
He still got growing to do.
Yeah, I still got growing to do, but I can kind of tell myself that I'm improving every day.
Yeah, listen, so you hear a little bit of a nervous laugh there from Kirby Smart of, ha, 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 ha. A nervous laugh when you hear one. That's a nervous one from Kirby, a guy that's not typically too nervous out in public. He's still got some growing to do, he says there, and frankly, there was another moment in the press conference where Smart took that point even further when a different reporter asked George Pickens of, how much do you feel you've grown at Georgia? How have you evolved over the course of your freshman year? Some of that nervousness in Smart's voice, I think you also heard some of that back in January as well. Let me give you another example of this.
How would you describe this season, your first season in college football?
Careful, George.
It was a great season to me. You win some, you lose some, but I feel like every day, every practice, every walkthrough, we just fought. I like winning that way instead of winning the easy way out. I like fighting for the win.
I'm sorry. I want that guy on my team. And I don't know what the backstory is that would cause Kirby Smart to say, careful, George, be careful what you say here, or nervous laughter on the notion of how are you different after the Sugar Bowl than you were earlier portion of the season. Smart's obviously an expert at, molding young men. He knows all the backstory there. I only know it's been made public. But when I hear George Pickens say, I have had to fight for everything that I've gotten, and I want to be a fighter. I want to earn what I have by virtue of fighting. I like that. That's what I want more of. And this is the point that I've made about George Pickens over and over again. This is the point that I'll repeat today. There is nothing that I know publicly about George Pickens. There's nothing that's been made public to me about Pickens that would scare me off of him as a player in any form, fashion whatsoever. Alex Scarborough says, hey, he's got to steer clear of trouble. You understand why you would say that. This is a young man that we know missed the two halves of games late in the seasons. Obviously, stuff outside the whistle contributed to him missing that time. It's not wrong to bring that up. But as I've said before, given the choice of a player who's got too much fight in him, and we saw this with our own eyes, how much fight Pickens can have in him, given the choice of someone who's got a little too much fight in him, finding a way to turn that volume down just a little bit, for me, is far better than the notion of a player who's not as intrinsically motivated, a player who's not as much of a natural fighter, trying to push that into him, trying to put some fire inside a player that doesn't have it. I think is virtually impossible to do, and essentially you've got to weed those kind of guys out during the recruiting process. But taking a guy who's got a little too much fight, and we all saw this with our own eyes, not just in the situation near the end of the Tech game, but various moments during the season when maybe Pickens' level of play went right to the echo of the whistle. If you get my drift here, this is a guy that clearly kind of plays the game with a chip on his shoulder. He might need to turn that volume down just a bit, but in terms of being scared off of a player that's got a little too much fight, a little too much edge to him, honestly, whatever Pickens has, I hope it's contagious. I hope a lot of Georgia players catch that, because the willingness to go out there and scratch, claw, and fight for everything you get, That's the kind of attitude you need to win in a place like Tuscaloosa or once again in Jacksonville or wherever the biggest games of the 2020 season are going to be held. However, beyond that, let me make another point for a moment. I'm a child of the 90s, and, there was no social media back then. There was no, message boards really for the most part when I was kind of coming up. Internet was kind of a very young, new thing, and yet we were all generally aware of each other's sports opinions. We just saw this play out with The Last Dance on ESPN on the Michael Jordan thing. It's kind of funny now to see people repeating opinions that were very common, way back then. When people watch The Last Dance now, the Michael Jordan documentary that just aired on ESPN, there's a lot of, I'm watching this, and Michael Jordan's a great player, but you know what? Scottie Pippen's kind of a great player too. Wow, Pippen was a great player in his own right. You hear a lot of this from the people who have watched The Last Dance on ESPN, and for someone who came of age, I was in the 8th grade when Jordan won his first title in 91. I guess I was nearing the end of my college career when Jordan won his last title with the Bulls, I think in 1998. Throughout the course of time, when we would get together and talk sports back then, it was very much the same thing of, Michael Jordan's a great player, maybe the greatest player of all time, but wow, Scottie Pippen's pretty good too. It was very cool to notice that the second guy in that discussion was also really good and was also, really worthy of attention, really worthy of paying attention to. And I'm obviously bringing this up for a reason. That Jordan-Pippen comparison, that template for the, the great player and the player just underneath him who benefits by playing with the great player, that's something we've really grown to understand a lot of in sports in recent years. And when I think about ESPN, who calls George Pickens the most exciting player on the Georgia roster, I think there's obviously possibly a chance that's true. But part of the excitement level that I think Pickens potentially brings to the table for Georgia this upcoming season is not just the excitement he himself is responsible for, but the way that as a kind of Michael Jordan-like figure, he opens the door for someone else on this roster to potentially be his Scottie Pippen. Maybe not a perfect analogy necessarily, but an analogy that I think makes sense. That Pickens may be the guy that's getting the most attention right now, but it's the person playing with Pickens, maybe just underneath Pickens, that ultimately provides the real excitement that the Georgia offense needs. Now, obviously, some of the potential candidates to do this, lining up alongside George, are some of those freshman receivers. Georgia signed a bunch of them for the 2020 class. Kirby Smart has not been shy in saying that a lot of these guys, whether it be the size of Robinson, the speed of Arian Smith, the overall level of athleticism of Jermaine Burton, the polish at the position for a guy like Marcus Rosemey, they all bring something different, but all potentially guys who could really benefit from playing next to Pickens. In fact, let me let you hear Kirby Smart talking about these receivers just for a moment.
Really excited about those guys. I mean, we've been excited about Justin for a long time. Marcus, too. They both came to our camp over the summer and were competitive kids, as you've seen, out there in one-on-ones. And both of them had good senior years. I mean, both of them won state championships. Arian's a kid who's got a lot of speed. It's pretty obvious that he can run fast. He wants to be able to run track here, which we've been very open to, and had success with Miko doing that. That was a big selling point for him.
Isn't it interesting that on a day in which we're talking about the topic of most exciting player on the Georgia roster, which ESPN says is George Pickens, Kirby Smart talking about some incoming freshman receivers, he uses that word twice in that same clip. Excited about Justin Robinson, excited about Arian Smith, obviously also excited about Rosemey and McConkey and Burton, the full list there. And I think that the unspoken truth from all that is the presence of Pickens makes the freshman receivers more exciting. And by the way, don't forget about the guys who've been here either. Kearis Jackson, Demetrius Robertson, obviously, guys like Tommy Bush and Matt Landers hoping that this is the year they finally get a chance to shine. Dominic Blaylock coming back from injury, who we talked about with Mike Griffith on the show yesterday. The overall bottom line is this. I don't dispute ESPN's take that George Pickens might be the most exciting player on the Georgia roster. However, if he is that kind of Michael Jordan level player, and I mean that, figuratively speaking, but that Michael Jordan level player for the Georgia wide receiving core, what could be truly exciting for the Georgia offense this season, and what could truly allow this unit to take that next step, is to find a Scottie Pippen to go along with him. Whether it be someone who's been here, who finally gets a chance to thrive, and what I think will be a better offense for Todd Monken, or a newcomer that comes along and does, as a freshman in 2020, what Pickens did as a freshman in 2019. One way or another, the real excitement that Pickens provides for the Georgia offense this year may be the other receivers that he allows for the chance to thrive. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. It's good to have you with us, no matter how you get to us today. Live on video, Facebook, YouTube, coming soon again on Twitter, radio at noon on Appen Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and as a podcast. Wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com, we're really glad to have you with us. And we really appreciate our friends at Merriweather and Tharp for making it all possible. You know, they're your source for Georgia divorce. That means something. Because if you look at the huge audience that we have for a show like this and just trust the statistics, there are a lot of people in our audience who either have dealt with a divorce, will soon deal with a divorce, maybe find themselves in the throes of that conversation right now. It's a tough spot to be in. No one denies that. But here's the thing that makes it easier. Here's the thing that makes it better. To have an advocate on your side. I just talked about this a moment ago with George Pickens, someone who's willing to fight, who's got that inside them, that willingness to go to work for something they believe in. That's what my friends at Merriweather and Tharp do, and a lot of this is free for you. That initial consultation, blog posts, podcast to familiarize yourself with the topic of divorce. But then when it's time to allow them to go to work for you, be that advocate on your side, help you rebuild your finances, help you restore, maintain the relationship you have with your family, including your children. That's what Merriweather and Tharp is famous for, and you can find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com. Theatlantadivorceteam.com. That gets you in touch with my friends at Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. They're going to do great work for you. All right, we went a little long there off the top of the show, so I'll try to be quick on this. We're going to welcome in Bud Elliott from 24/7 Sports in just a moment. Bud is the architect, the author of the Blue Chip Ratio, which we talk about from time to time here on our program, the notion that the only teams in the modern age in college football that win national championships are those that have more than 50% of the roster over the course of the last 4 years made up of former 4- and 5-star players. We've said before that, Georgia's very high on this list, number 2 overall, with 82% of its roster made up of former 4- and 5-star recruits, and yet Georgia's still trying to break through and win the national championship. Bud Elliott from 24/7 Sports will be very candid with us on that topic coming up in just a minute. Before we get to that, though, let me squeeze this in. Couldn't help but notice an interesting tweet from Georgia tight end Rylan Godey. And I've said before that when I think about the tight end position for Georgia this year, a lot of obviously attention being paid to Darnell Washington because he was a 5-star. And, there's the excitement that comes from Trey McKitty as a graduate transfer from Florida State. But I have kind of touted for some of the tight ends who've been on the roster and gained some experience in the program to maybe have their chance to be a part of what goes on here. A tweet from Godey with that in mind did get my attention just a little bit. This is cryptic, but we'll read into this maybe just a bit. He says, a whole lot of adversity that's going to make the success that much more sweet. What does that mean? You can be left to fill in the gaps for yourself on this. Obviously, Godey's a guy that his first year on campus was, I think, marred by injury. And given that as an idea, maybe you speculate and say this tweet also suggests that he's still dealing with a little bit of an injury bug situation one way or another. I would say this is a situation worth monitoring. And I know there's some online chatter about maybe, Darnell Washington kind of, battling through something right now there as well. This is a position group for Georgia now for a couple of years. We've talked about maybe not being as deep as Smart would like it. Obviously, Georgia's recruited well to position and yet still felt the need to go get graduate transfer Eli Wolf out of Tennessee a year ago, McKitty for that spot here this year. So Georgia trying to figure out the depth that it has at the tight end spot. Godey is a player that I expect to be a part of that conversation, and yet that tweet maybe suggests, at least for now, Ryland is working his way through something, and so we'll wish him well as he attempts to do all of that. It's good to have you with us here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. Let me do one more thing quickly before we talk to Bud Elliott from 24/7 Sports. I know many of you have participated in our Kroger Father's Day sweepstakes. This is really fun. You've sent your photos, your videos of yourself enjoying a UGA experience with your kids, or you enjoying one with your dad, or someone like that. And it's been fun to see all of those. Many of you shared those with me on social media. And for the folks who have, continue to encourage folks to vote for yours. And you go to DawgNation.com, find out more about this, participate there in that process. And for those who want to go to DawgNation.com and see the great collection of photos and videos that have kind of come in here, this is a fun way to do that. One of the things we're big believers on in this show is just the value of, sharing these moments of fandom with generations. I'm glad that it was given to me. I'm glad now that I get to pass that gift on to my kids. It's really important to see so many of you kind of enjoying the situation in much the same way. I just think is a really gratifying thing to be able to see. So we appreciate all of you who are participating in that. By the way, someone's going to win a gift card and a grill courtesy of Kroger. There's really no better Father's Day than that. Two of the things that probably make me about as happy as anything. New grill, gift card. Well, Kroger's providing that to some lucky winner The voting is ongoing for that. So if your photo video is a part of this, encourage people on social media to vote for you. And if you want to see all the collection of photos that are out there, you can check out more about that at DawgNation.com. All right, later on, we will get into another national outlet kind of touting for Florida in comparison to Georgia. We will talk more about that. But for now, what's the real story between the Dogs and the Gators? How much more talent does UGA really have? And when might all of that talent break through and allow Georgia to win a national championship? Guy that's crunched the numbers is Bud Elliott from 24/7 Sports. He joins us here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp, and it's great to have all of you with us as well. It's always a pleasure for us here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp, to get a chance to talk to Bud Elliott, now with 24/7 Sports, but doing a lot of the great recruiting work that he's been doing for a number of years. Bud, appreciate you spending some time on our show today, and we hope that you're doing well.
Yeah, guys, I appreciate you having me on.
So let me begin with this. I feel like that I was kind of in on the blue chip ratio, the story that, the report that you've been writing for a number of years, well before it was cool. And yet over the last few years, it seems like the attention you've gotten every year when you've done the blue chip ratio piece, which is looking at the 4- and 5-star players on a roster and the really the precursor that is for winning a national championship. It seems like it's getting a lot more attention in recent years. I'm sure it must be gratifying to know that this theory that you've kind of posited over the years has really kind of caught on in the mainstream as much as it has. I would imagine that's true, right?
Yeah, it took a long time, I think, for it to catch on. But now I think most people realize that recruiting doesn't guarantee championships. But if you don't recruit at this level, we can pretty much guarantee that you won't win the biggest prize in college football. And there's a lot of joy to be taken from a lot of different aspects of college football. But for certain fan bases, I think they do go into the season a little bit with sort of maybe not national championship or bust, but at least a compete for national championships or bust. And we've seen a bit of a shifting narrative in the media probably over the last decade or so. And we used to get people saying, "Oh, Ole Miss could win a title, or Wisconsin, or Michigan State, Baylor, TCU." Remember that kind of whole era when they were going, they would win 10, 11 games and be in the hunt
Sure.
for the playoff. And now we really don't see that. And I'm not going to take full credit for that, but I do think that there's been a little bit of an awakening here amongst college football media that, look, you really do have to sign these studs out of high school at a certain minimum level if you really want to have a shot.
So the team that we pay attention to around here, UGA, is number 2 on your list of blue chip ratio, 82% former 4- and 5-star players on the roster right now, just behind Alabama at number 1. And, Bud, we do this show for fans from the perspective of a fan, so I'll speak as a fan for a moment. If you had told me way back when Kirby Smart first took this job in 2016, 4 years and 5 recruiting classes ago, that just a few years into the future, George would have that level of blue chip ratio, that number of former 4- and 5-star prospects on the roster, I guess back then I would have assumed that Georgia was stacking national championships, and yet to get to 82%, they've only done the work necessary to essentially make it a fair fight against Alabama when the two teams play in September and possibly rematch again in December. What do you make of the way that Georgia's kind of risen under Smart, and yet concurrent to that, a lot of these other elite recruiting programs such as Alabama have essentially kind of raised their level right there along at the same rate?
Sure. So I think there's a couple things going on here. Number one, we see teams sort of all over the spectrum of the blue chip ratio win it, right? Like Clemson, Florida State have won the national title with like low 50s or low 60s percentage, and then obviously Bama and Ohio State have won with much higher numbers. We are seeing a bit of a rise in numbers here in recent years because what we've seen now is with the signing class limitations, right? So where you can't go pull a Houston Nutt or like an Auburn or probably Georgia back when they don't have the numbers in front of me, to where you would sign 31, 32 kids, which would kind of depress your percentage a little bit math-wise. Now, with the sort of that more hard cap, we've seen everybody's numbers rise some, but certainly Kirby Smart has taken Georgia to a different level. I mean, they really stack a whole lot of talent, and I think you'd be an idiot, quite frankly, to say that having more talent is not beneficial. But we haven't seen maybe quite as strong a correlation as we would think. Where if you're up in that 80% range, I don't know that it gives you that much of a better shot. I think Clemson's an interesting example here to look at as a team that's very close to Georgia. Like, I think Clemson actually could recruit even better if it wanted to. Yeah. But I think there's a lot of kids Clemson won't take due to character or fit concerns. Like, I think Clemson can snap their fingers tomorrow and be close to the 80% range. But there's just a lot of kids they don't think it's their program. And so there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, so to speak. But I mean, Georgia has done a tremendous job.
So what would your message be to the UGA fan who's a little impatient, been waiting for a while, sees the recruiting success, and yet, as I said, knows that Alabama's still a grizzly bear to deal with in the conference, knows that a Clemson or Ohio State waits in the college football playoff? Frankly, as it stands right now, Georgia's probably not a point spread favorite on a neutral field against either of those three teams that I just mentioned. As someone who follows this from the national perspective, kind of outside the bubble of Dog Nation here, what's your message for UGA fans in terms of the impatience that starts to fester when the wait for a national championship ends up being a little longer than some Georgia fans wish that it was?
So I'm pretty high on Georgia this year, but I think we've had a philosophical shift in college football. And you do not see defensive head coaches winning the national title anymore unless they've really just sort of thrown open that offense and said, okay, go score points. Our job as a defense will be to limit the opponent. I think we're pretty smart. We're still kind of waiting. A lot of Georgia fans probably think that the hire of Monken and bringing in Jamie Newman, who I think is a pretty good player, are going to be the answers, and they might be right. I mean, Kirby Smart's mentor, Nick Saban, he did it. He had to realize, man, like, you have to score points now in college football. Like, you can't just run the ball first, second down, and then try to throw on 3rd and 6, because look at LSU last year. Their defense, by I think a lot of standards in previous years and previous decades, was not a national championship caliber defense.
Yeah. It
didn't matter. They were going to score 40 on pretty much everybody, and sometimes 50 or 60. The game has changed to where it's a more wide open passing game, and I think you have got to be able to score points in bunches if you want to win a national title. So for Georgia, it's all eyes on the offense. Like, I think they're the best defense in the country. And yet, I mean, that doesn't give me that much confidence they're going to win an Natty.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Let me try to squeeze in two quick issues before we let you go. When it comes to the SEC East, Florida also makes it into your blue chip ratio, crossing the threshold. I think you're at low 60s in terms of the percentage of former 4 and 5 stars on the roster. And yet, when I look at this, as objectively as I guess we possibly can, I still see what I view as a roster advantage for Georgia. And as much as Dan Mullen's been touted as an in-game coach or a guy that can do more with less, I think we see enough of a track record of Mullen against Smart, for me, speaking on behalf of Georgia fans here, to not really be all that worried about Dan Mullen in Florida in the SEC East yet, even though there's certainly plenty of national publications who've kind of touted for Florida this year. From a more objective standpoint, in your eyes, how do you handicap the SEC East between Georgia and Florida, given where both those teams rank on your blue chip ratio?
Sure. So the one caveat I put in there is I never use this to pick games. I've tested this as far as picking games. You will lose your shirt if you try to pick games against the spread. Right? Like, this is only to be used for, like, have you recruited well enough as a bare minimum to win a national championship by historical standards. But as far as the East race, I think Florida is, we would agree, they're probably a little bit more of a sure thing. But Georgia's ceiling, I also think, is much higher because they're a more talented team. I think Georgia has clearly the better defense. Georgia might have the better offense, but I don't know if anybody's really comfortable predicting that right now. As far as the track record against Mullen, I think our Brandon Marcello at 20% Force did a great job writing about this recently. And, Kirby Smart's defense pretty much owned Dan Mullen's offense. Now, at the same time, we also need to acknowledge that, that was the first 2 years Mullen was at Florida, so he really didn't have his guys in place. And prior to that, it was Kirby at Bama and the 1 year at Georgia versus Mississippi State, which talent-wise, you want to talk about a gap, that's a real gap. Mississippi State does not compete for elite prospects. So I think Kirby Smart does have a pretty good feel for what Dan Mullen does on offense, and his results are awesome. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have a lock on Dan Mullen's offense forever. I mean, my guess is that at some point, Mullen will put up some points on Georgia. I don't know if it's going to be this year against this defense, though. And so for Georgia, there's a little uncomfortable feeling I would guess for Georgia fans. Can we score enough?
Right.
Is this offense going to be good? Because if it is, then I think Georgia's going to be pretty hard to beat.
I think that's a fair point. Let me squeeze this last thing before we let you go. Something else that you've written about over the course of the offseason is the huge number of committed players now in comparison to where we would have seen from the same period a year ago. And obviously a lot of the attention during the offseason has been paid to Tennessee because they were just racking up commits and really still have, getting a 4-star tight end within the last few days here. Obviously, everyone knows that Jeremy Pruitt's a good recruiter. That's one of the reasons why he was able to get the Tennessee job when he did. I guess, how real is the situation that you're seeing there at Tennessee in terms of, I think you've predicted they likely will be in your blue chip ratio next year, crossing that 50% threshold. In terms of upgrading the talent, how much of that truly do you see going on with Jeremy Pruitt in Knoxville right now?
Well, I think that Jeremy Pruitt and his staff here in Knoxville are really good recruiters. Like you said, they did a good job of selling their strong finish to the season last year, and they were very aggressive and I think pretty smart to go out and get a bunch of commitments early on during the pandemic. I think they correctly forecasted the lack of visits and camps that would be coming, and so they're going to this year. Now, of course, now that those kids have that Tennessee logo next to their name, like Tennessee is now the hunted, and they're going to have to play defense for the rest of the cycle. And I'm sure some decommits will come, just as they are with probably any program. But if you're one of those programs that has 20-plus kids committed right now, I think your decommitment risk is slightly higher simply because, like, we know a certain number of these prospects have never actually visited you in person. They've never visited elsewhere. And so they're making decisions from a standpoint of less information than it normally would, which I think is a recipe for greater decommitment, not just at Tennessee, but really all over the country.
I think that's a really interesting point and a good way to finish our conversation. Bud, for the folks who want more of the work you're doing, reading the Blue Chip Ratio article for themselves or looking at the rest of your recruiting coverage, how can they find you on social media and read the work that you're doing?
Sure. So my social media for work is at Bud Elliott 3, just Bud Elliott number 3, and also 247sports.com.
Bud, thanks for your time. Enjoy the rest of your summer.
You too, bud.
All right, good stuff there from Bud Elliott at 24/7 Sports, spending some time with us there on DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp. I want to respond to what Bud said. Let me also mention this real quickly as we're doing the interview there. We actually pre-recorded that with Bud a little earlier. I'm noticing some of our video platforms, I guess Facebook having a little bit of an issue today, so much so that a lot of the Facebook Live viewers have migrated over to YouTube. For those of you that are radio or podcast listeners, you don't really realize the level of, I guess, competition that's ongoing between some of our live comment sections. So kind of interesting to see the interaction now with a lot of the folks who are typically Facebookers over on the YouTube side. I apologize for the technical difficulty there on Facebook. I guess it's kind of lagging by several minutes, and it's affecting the audio quality over there on Facebook. So if you're normally a Facebook viewer, I certainly apologize for that. And obviously, good to know we have the YouTube platform up and running, and obviously really thankful to be able to deliver a podcast later on today for anybody who may have had a interruption on the video side of that. That is the kind of thing we take very seriously. And yet the best that I can tell, this seems to be coming from the Facebook platform and not originating with us here in the DawgNation World Headquarters Studios. But nonetheless, we'll keep looking at this, kind of seeing what's going on. And for those of you who've moved from Facebook to YouTube, certainly my apologies for the inconvenience there. Now, as far as the response to Bud Elliott, there's something that he said that I think is really interesting, and I wanted to try to talk to him about this, but just in an interview like that, when you want to cover a lot of ground, you can't spend too much time on any one topic. He talked about how Clemson has won national championships with kind of a lower level of the so-called blue chip ratio, low 60s in terms of the percentage of former 4- and 5-star players in the roster. LSU kind of did that a year ago without kind of crossing that 75-80% number. They're also kind of down there at the 60s. And the one thing that I noticed about that from Bud's own research, from Bud's on reporting about this is, it seems to me that it's a lot easier to win the national championship with a lesser level of blue chip talent, former 4- and 5-star players, if you've got an all-time great quarterback. Now, Bud says he thinks Clemson could recruit better if they wanted to. Maybe they could, maybe they couldn't. For me, that's not as important in this regard as this, is that for LSU, which measurably has not recruited as well as Alabama, measurably has not recruited as well in recent years as Georgia, all of that was made fine, and all of that was completely overlooked and correctly overlooked because of the fact that you had Joe Burrow having an all-time great season, led by what I thought was just an unbelievable passing game coordinator, Joe Brady, a year ago. That when the offense runs that well, when the quarterback Burrow has that good of a season, you kind of overlook some other holes in the roster. As Bud correctly notes, LSU didn't really have a great defense a year ago, but it didn't matter because the offense was so good. I think the same thing is kind of true for Clemson. We've seen Clemson be one of the elite teams in all of college football. yet the national championships they won, they had all-time great quarterbacks really in both those. I think a lot of people think Trevor Lawrence is on his way to kind of building that kind of career. Looking back on Deshaun Watson, who could dispute that he's one of the great quarterbacks in the modern age of the sport? You almost wonder the overall level of talent that Clemson has, the less aggressive approach, generally speaking, to recruiting, how much of that has been aided by the fact that you've truly had great quarterbacks? And conversely, on the Georgia side of this, how much of Georgia's overall talent advantage is somewhat muted by the fact that Georgia has not gotten stellar play from its quarterback, certainly not in 2019, and maybe even in 2017, 2018, when things for Georgia otherwise were good. The offense still not quite as explosive as the most explosive offense in the country. Pretty clearly there from Elliott, the key takeaway is, for as talented as Georgia has been and as close as it has been to winning a national championship, the next step in that process is building an offense that matches some of the success that's been enjoyed by the defense.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
All right, we'll shift some gears here, talk some SEC. Good to have you with us on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. And time now for SEC Through. And there's a report out there that there's a change coming to a show that, maybe you watch, maybe you don't. College Game Day on ESPN, I think after all these years, is still a pretty big platform for TV when it comes to college football fans. If you're at home, that's generally the way that a lot of you start your day. And for those of you who are out tailgating in Athens, that's the kind of thing that's always kind of fun to have as the tailgate just kind of getting started, seeing where game day is, seeing Kirk and Corso and Pollock and the rest of the team there kind of set the tone for the debate and the discussion that's going to be ongoing throughout the day. While ESPN College Game Day is on over in the SEC network, they have SEC Nation, which is sort of the SEC-centric version of what College Game Day is supposed to be. They travel around from spot to spot. They are, on site, trying to sort of generate some debate with the SEC. For whatever reason, SEC Nation for me has never really quite taken off, even in any level whatsoever in comparison to what College Game Day has been. But there is some news out there today. Andrew Marchand from the New York Post is reporting that Jordan Rodgers is on his way into the show as Paul Feinbaum and Marcus Spears reportedly are leaving. The Feinbaum thing is not really interesting me one way or another on this, but the Spears part of this is kind of interesting because while this is not really part of Marchand's reporting, you have certainly seen a lot more of Spears on TV as of late. He's been, the best I can tell, kind of a fixture on like First Take and some of those shows. Clearly, it seems that Marcus Spears is growing into a new role compared to where he's been before. And we have seen ESPN personalities kind of travel down this path before, where it almost seems like ESPN sometimes treats college football personalities. They almost treat the college football coverage as kind of, I'm going to overstate this. I don't mean to say it this way, but it's almost like the minor leagues. This is like the AAA level, and if you do well there, then we'll move you to one of the studio shows or we'll move you to the NFL. And a lot of times it seems to me that when a guy goes from the college stuff to the NFL stuff or the more studio stuff, sometimes it ends up not working out as well for that guy, and so therefore we have a tendency to turn on the broadcaster as opposed to seeing it differently. The perfect example of this is, Booger McFarland moving from his role as a college football analyst, a role that I thought he was great at, to Monday Night Football, and in that spot on Monday Night Football, all of a sudden, McFarland became the butt of jokes. People said that he wasn't good enough to have that role and everything else, and it's almost like, he's now kind of viewed as a failure. Whereas I think that what might be actually going on here is a misunderstanding on the part of ESPN, that when a guy is really good at being a college football analyst, really good about speaking about the sport, this rush to move him to some other spot that you think is somehow bigger and better, I mean, based on the overall attention of the public, obviously the NFL is bigger than college football, no one disputes that, but in terms of the attention that it gets during the fall, college football is no small product. So when a guy like McFarland is good in that spot, why not just leave him there? And I think Marcus Spears has been really good on TV in a number of roles. I've seen him on First Take a couple times. I think he's really entertaining in that spot. He's unabashedly an LSU fan. He's kind of gotten some attention from that. I got no problem. But this notion of, we've got a good analyst here in Marcus Spears, we've got a good TV personality, we need to find something else for him beyond just being a college football analyst. Why mess with something that's working? That's my take there on that. And you see this with other personalities there as well, where there's seemingly a rush to get them into a new role, but ultimately, when you find the magic, when you find the connection with the college football audience, why not just let that be enough and pay them according to the impact they're making with a substantial number of sports fans? moving on here and talking about something different for a moment, we've spoken a lot lately about some of the national publications and what they're saying about Georgia, what they're saying about Florida in the SEC East. We saw Athlon, a magazine that I like, rank Florida ahead of Georgia in its preview magazine not too long ago. We've seen other publications kind of do the same thing. Other national writers have kind of done the same thing. You can now add to that list Lindy's. Lindy's is another one of these long-time magazines that's been on newsstands forever. In their preseason magazine, they have this as the way the SEC shakes out. Florida at 1, Georgia 2. They've got Florida as the number 5 team in the country, Georgia as the number 7 team in the country, ahead of Tennessee, Kentucky, South Carolina, Missouri, Vanderbilt over in the SEC West. If you're concerned about that, it's Alabama, then LSU, then Auburn, then Texas A&M. So a little lower on Texas A&M is Lindy compared to the rest of college football. There's nothing I can say about this that I haven't already said before. I have got no problem with someone putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to Florida. These magazines live on forever. Not only do I buy the new ones every single year, somewhere in my house, basement, wherever else, you can find all the old ones there as well. So if Lindy's wants to tout Florida ahead of Georgia, if other writers want to tout Florida ahead of Georgia, that's totally fine. But we will remember. We will keep these receipts. And as I've been saying, at a certain point in time, the showdown on all of this. Hey, Dan Mullen's not as good a recruiter, but man, how good is he at developing talent? At a certain point in time, that's going to be proven one way or another. I think it's this year that storyline either takes on new life, breathes in new air, and is even bigger in the future, or you're going to put it to bed. Because when you've got the returning quarterback, when you've got a little bit of a track record, this is 3 years now for Dan Mullen. He's moving into year 3 there at Florida. If not now, when is it going to be? When Georgia, as some Florida fans would say, was forced to go to Wake Forest to find its quarterback, when Georgia was forced to jettison its offensive coordinator because of the lack of success for James Coley a year ago, it would seem to be that the Georgia offense, at least to some, especially those who are either skeptics of Georgia or just outright fans of another program, it would seem that Georgia is vulnerable on the offensive side of the ball right now. But if Kirby finds the better quarterback, if Kirby builds the better offense. And by the way, when Bud Elliott was with us a couple of minutes ago, he certainly suggested that was a possibility, that even after all this, Georgia still has the better offense in comparison to Florida, and the overall raw talent would certainly suggest that there's a chance that's true. Then I don't want to hear another word about Dan Mullen beyond 2020 if all of this plays out again the way that it has the last couple of years. However, here's the one moment that I'll be kind of fair and balanced, and then we'll move on and talk about something different. Last year, I said something about Florida that turned out to be wrong. Last year, it was a different studio then, but in a similar studio, similar situation, talking to you on this show, I said that every year there's a preseason top 10 team that ends up unranked, and I cited all the reasons for why I thought that'd be Florida. And the truth is, near the beginning of the season, it seemed like it'd be true. Florida's probably lucky to beat Miami, probably got some officiating help to slip by South Carolina. There were some moments in the season in which Florida seemed vulnerable. But by the time the year was done, even after losing to Georgia, Florida kind of righted the ship. And for a second consecutive year, Dan Mullen did finish in the top 10. So as we move to sort of the next level of this Georgia-Florida rivalry under Kirby Smart, it is probably true that Georgia no longer has a weak, unsubstantial Florida to deal with. In 2017, that was true. Even in 2018, the early days of Dan Mullen, that may have still been true. By the end of that year, Florida kind of gotten better. 2019, Florida kind of matched that performance. So Florida is back to being a little bit of a measuring stick. I'll at least give the Gators, credit there in that regard. The one thing I'm going to stop short of saying, the way that Lindy's and some of these other publications seems to want to, is that all of this means that now Florida's ready to take the next step. That last step is a doozy, and I don't believe Florida's anywhere close to being able to make that big leap, and will make that your SEC through. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp, I want to turn our attention back to a serious topic just for a moment. You have seen some very interesting things going on at the University of Georgia over the course of the last couple of days, and by UGA in this sense, I mean beyond the football program. I guess the university system of Georgia, which operates a lot of the state universities within the state, has convened a committee, I guess is the best way to say this. They're looking at some of the names on the buildings. Now, I'll be very clear about something. This is one of those moments in which I'm not all that educated on this topic because, as many of you are aware, I'm like a pickup truck alumnus to UGA. I grew up as a fan, did not graduate from Georgia. I'm like many of you who've watched Georgia football my entire life, but don't have much of a connection to the university itself. So this topic doesn't mean as much to me as it might mean to some of you for whichever side you might find yourself on it. but there is some discussion of changing the names of some of the buildings. Kirby Smart has come out in support of this. Let me show you the tweet from Smart on video. I'll read it to you. He says, as both a UGA alum and head football coach, I fully support the University System of Georgia's Board of Regents and Chancellor's decision to form this committee to study these important issues. This is an important first step in the right direction to help us evaluate our history and work to bring us closer together. So it certainly seems like on the basis of that, Smart is on board with what could lead to some changes in terms of the way that UGA views its history, and obviously that has an effect on how the state will then view its history as well, given the fact that Georgia is the flagship institution there. You know, as I said before, this is not as personal a topic for me because I am not a UGA grad, but this will certainly be something that's watched closely. Something else that has come out, the Redcoat Band has put out a tweet, a message really through Twitter, that one of the traditions that they've been a part of for a number of years, the playing of the Tara theme, which is the song from the Gone with the Wind, they're no longer going to play that. Now, this is something that I happen to know about because back, years ago, I used to go to games as a fan, and at the end of the game, I'd watch the Redcoat Band perform at the end. The Tara theme, when they play it, is like way after the game. This is 25 minutes after the game, something along those lines. So a lot of people wouldn't even be aware this is something they'd played before, the music from Gone with the Wind. I did happen to know that. This is a change that's been made, gotten some national attention. ESPN even had this the top of the page on ESPN.com, or near the top of the page this morning. It's been on the crawl on the ESPN TV networks today there as well. The average Georgia fan may not be aware of this because most of you aren't in the stadium when it actually takes place, but the Redcoat Band making that announcement that got some attention there as well. So potentially some changes coming for UGA, one in terms of what the Redcoat Band is going to do, and we'll see what the university itself decides to do moving forward as our society deals with a lot of tough issues right now. So we'll keep all of that in mind. Of course, you hear the fight song playing there as we get ready to wrap things up today. On a much more lighthearted note, I'll remind you as we get ready to wrap things up, Gator Hater Updater. Obviously, we enjoy talking Georgia, Florida, and the rivalry. We like having a rival to kick around, here, and we don't mind when the Florida fans going to come back and do that towards UGA. It's part of what makes college football fun, and it's also fun to let you know that it's now been 1,328 days since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. Man, that's good news, and when these two teams get back together on October 31st, seeing that Gator Hater Updater continue to climb is going to be a big, big talking point, big storyline for us. Thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. Hope you all have a great day. We'll see you back here again tomorrow. And on video. If anybody's even left on Facebook, we'll get some comments over there. And then we will obviously spend some time on YouTube. Yeah, we've just about been abandoned on Facebook. I guess the last one left over here on Facebook, turn out the lights. And for those of you, who maybe didn't hear my statement before, I know we've had some problems over there. I apologize. Matt and Rukavina encouraging people to jump over to YouTube. Yeah, I'm sorry, y'all. We'll look into this and see where it's going in terms of why this has been a problem. So I apologize. But we'll take some comments nonetheless and remind you it's our R.S. Andrews cool down, air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric. It's about to be hot again. That means air conditioning will be working overdrive. So please make sure you check out R.S. Andrews for all of that. If you're worried about your system, let's face it, you know how old your system is. You know if it's on its last legs. Well, take advantage of the R.S. Andrews tune-up to get that system back to factory fresh specs. Make sure it's ready to go, keeping you cold for the summer. And if it's time to talk about a new one, obviously R.S. Andrews can talk about that with you as well. Find Dari and the whole team over there online at rsandrews.com. We certainly appreciate that. All right, let me just do a couple of Facebook, then I'll spend most of my time on YouTube because that's where most of you seem to be at this moment. Yeah, Bob Piquet, sorry about the problems here today. Keith Fold says, sorry the Redcoat Band won't be playing Tara, but I understand. Yeah, obviously, a lot of folks dealing with, a lot of things right now and thinking about what the right look for our society is. So everyone's kind of trying to take that as seriously as they possibly can. Let's see what else is going on. Let me just go over to YouTube because my Facebook, like many of yours, is like 20 minutes old right now. Philip Wells says Facebook needs to wipe off the play side of the CD. Not even sure what that means, but it's interesting to see Philip over here on the YouTube side of things today. Chad Williams says Nick Saban hacked Facebook. Yeah, that's what I'm going with. I think I've been hacked by Nick Saban. Green Soldier says we're younger and more passionate. There's a youthful energy over here on the YouTube side. Nice to see people participating and be a part of. Dennis Wilson says that the Facebook renters will be evicted if rent isn't paid in full. So good to see Dennis having some fun here. Dennis also had a funny line earlier where he said, speaking of Philip Jordan Wells, he goes, I know things must be better over at Facebook if Philip Jordan Wells in this comment section over here. Lego Joe says, how will Ladd McConkey fit into our new offense? Ladd's one of those guys that when you watch his film from when we all became aware of him, right when he signed with Georgia in the February portion of the 2020 signing class, his ability to make people miss in a short space, that sort of short distance quickness, I think is very interesting. And at Georgia, that's the kind of thing you could see UGA trying to utilize. I think the problem for McConkey, and really this is the problem for a lot of players at Georgia, is that there are so many potential receivers. And on the one hand, proven depth is obviously a big issue. And that's the kind of thing that the average fan or analyst is going to notice. But on the other end of things, if you're a receiver trying to take advantage of these opportunities, the number of people who are also trying to do the same thing is really high. I say this all the time, that players on the roster and observers of the program have very different definitions of the word depth. I would look at Georgia and say, there's not enough wide receiver depth right now. But a player in that spot on the team, in that position group, would look at the same situation and say, it's really, really crowded in terms of people who are like me, who just want their shot and just want their chance to thrive. So the thing that's going to, be tough for McConkey initially is coming in as a freshman. There's just not a ton of room right now for obvious openings and guys who've been there a little bit longer, or even incoming freshmen, guys like Justin Robinson, who've even he's been there longer because he was going through practices ahead of the Sugar Bowl when McConkey was still in the process of making his college decision. So I think that because McConkey has a very interesting skill set, really good, it's like you can almost picture him being like the greatest flag football player of all time because it's just hard to touch him. He just very, very shifty. Very just a lot of constant movement from him. You could eventually see a situation where he utilizes that talent to his advantage. But in the early going, the sheer number of players competing for playing time could be difficult for him to overcome. Matt Rukavina says, and by the way, once again, also interesting to see him over here on Facebook. I say we see Darnell Washington a good amount this year. He's too good to keep off the field. From an athletic standpoint, it's obvious why you're saying that. I mentioned this briefly before. There's also some online chatter as of late that Washington may be dealing with a little bit of a thing right now. So, we'll kind of see where that leads to him. I guess my question about Darnell is going to be, is how polished is that athleticism coming into this year? Clearly he's got the size. Seemingly he has the speed. I know, I always make this comparison, maybe it's fair, maybe it's not, but I know what a Rick Gilbert was doing each and every Friday night at Marietta because a lot of us saw that. He was playing with an SEC-level quarterback. He's playing on an elite program and working on his pass-catching skills, working on being kind of a focal point of the offense. Rick Gilbert had a lot of experience doing that at Marietta. What was Darnell Washington doing in Las Vegas? I'm admittedly less sure about all of that. I don't necessarily consider Washington to be quite as polished as a prospect as I would have thought Gilbert to be. That doesn't mean that that Matt could end up being wrong about this and Washington doesn't have a great freshman season. I guess in terms of the impact that Darnell is able to make, my assumption would be if it comes later more so than sooner. I just think that tight end's a challenging position because you're obviously, asking a guy in that spot to be good at almost a skill set that from like two different position groups. You got to have the requisite physicality. You got to be a good blocker, and you've got to also, kind of understand, crisp route running and things like that. It's not an easy position probably to play right away for a young man coming out of high school. So if we see those big flashes from Darnell, I think the safest prediction is to assume they come later rather than earlier. But we shall see. Chad Williams says, I wonder how the layoff will affect Monken's offense since he has so many formations. Yeah, the one thing I've said over and over on this chat is that I don't think Monken proves his brilliance by how complicated he makes his offense. I certainly don't. I think there's a way to do this, and honestly, I'm not smart enough to know it necessarily, but I think there's a way to do this where you really find the offensive schematic options that benefit you the most and make sure you install those, make sure you instill those into the minds of your players. And utilize what works best and then add to that over the course of the season. That's what I hope goes on there anyway. Pine Sol Lemon Scent, make sure we collect all of our coins from the Facebook crew. Good to see Pine Sol today, by the way. Let's see a couple other things here. John Adams asks a good question. He says, what advantages will be gained or lost based on fan attendance this year, including September 19th at Alabama? Obviously, I would say the game is easier to win for Georgia if it's played without fans at Alabama or even a limited number of fans. And I've kind of kicked around this number of how many fans have to be in the stadium for it to be loud. You know, Georgia's got the football on third down, crowds uproaring. How many fans would have to be in there for that to matter? I've sort of said that if you've got 50,000 fans in the stands, that's going to be loud. That's going to be, you know, almost as loud as 100,000 would be. I don't know that 100,000 fans are twice as loud as 50,000 fans are, even though it's twice as many people. If it's 15 or 20,000 fans in a 100,000 seat stadium, I don't think that's going to be enough to truly make a ton of noise. For those of you who've ever been in Sanford Stadium very early in the day before the stadium fills up, you know, those aluminum bleachers, when they're not filled, they have a weird echo to them, and it just kind of drowns out the music. Everything just sort of sounds really weird when there's no fans in the stands. It's one of the reasons why, you know, you saw Korean baseball put stuffed animals in the seats. And I know that kind of got treated as a joke, but in terms of the acoustic environment it creates for the stadium, I actually thought that was a pretty good idea. I know from the studios that we've built, when you have an empty studio with no furniture in it, everything just sort of sounds weird. And I think tinny is the word that you use. Just everything just kind of sounds weird. But the moment you start filling the room, all of a sudden now the sound kind of sounds the way that it's supposed to. Of course, the Facebook audience today would disagree, but you get the point that I'm making. So as long as there's more empty aluminum than fans, I think you're going to have a weird vibe that doesn't feel like a home field advantage. But once you get 50%, something along those lines, I mean, let's face it, a lot of stadiums in college football aren't bigger than 50,000 fans anyway. So if a 100,000 seat Bryant-Denny, roughly speaking, is half full, then I think that's going to feel a little bit like a home field advantage. If it's down there in that sort of 15, 20% range, or 15 to 20,000, you know, fan situation, that to me is not going to quite feel as much of a home field advantage. And it'll be very interesting to see how the betting market handle this. Typically giving you about 3 points or so for being at home. You know, do you still get that home field advantage if the stadium is not full? In fact, I know there's been some discussion of NBA playoffs, things like that, going to be taking place in Orlando. Typically, you award the better team with home field advantage. There's obviously none of that by playing in Orlando. What do you do to give some advantage to the team that would typically have the home court, you know, to them? It's going to be the same thing for college football, at least in one regard of what's the benefit of playing at home if you don't have the crowd behind you? I think that's I'm actually curious to see all that comes out about that. Keith Fold says, I remember when Sanford was only about 60,000 people. It was very loud. That's a cool thing to remember, Keith. Some of those pictures from the old days prior to the East End Zone being filled in, you know, back when the West End Zone when I was a kid was just aluminum bleachers like a high school. To go back and look at some of those old photos is pretty interesting to be able to see. Not Just Rock says, got to figure, though, that only about half of that 50,000 will be for one team or the other, so the sound won't be too much of an advantage either way. I think there's something kind of interesting about that, Not Just Rocks, which is that if you have a really socially distant crowd, let's say only 50,000 in a place like Alabama or even less than that, I don't believe they're going to put those tickets in a situation where they can be I could foresee a scenario where if it's a normal situation, if it's normal seating for Georgia, Alabama, there are tens of thousands of UGA fans there, at least 20,000 fans. We've seen that, you know, LSU a couple of years ago, these big road games, Tennessee last year, these big road games, Georgia fans just really travel for those games. But if these stadiums are forced to social distance, if they're forced to limit the number of people coming in, I believe that the universities themselves or the athletic associations themselves will utilize some technology that prevents the tickets from ending up in the hands of people they don't want them to have. I think you've seen this weekend with the NASCAR race at Talladega. You know, at least to my knowledge, because I looked into it, there's not like this glut of, you know, there's 5,000 tickets available for the race this weekend. You can't just go to like one of the secondary ticket websites and buy those tickets. They have got a certain kind of technology about how the tickets are passed around, and I think that college football will utilize the same thing. If they're limiting the people who get in, I think they're going to limit the way in which the people who are eligible for tickets get a chance to get them. That's my guess on that. Let's do a couple of more. John Adams says, if the stadium's not full, does the in-game production team turn down or turn up the volume? I think it's a really good question. My guess is they'll try to keep the music the way that it's kind of similarly been. Like the one thing that the TV does not want, for a variety of reasons, you can sort of assume some of this on your own, but the one thing that TV does not want is they don't want a bunch of game noise escaping out over the air. Coaches want to protect some of that. What's actually being said sometimes on the field, they may want to, kind of protect some of that. So I think for the TV networks, they've got a kind of a tricky decision of how do you present this? We've seen this in golf, where I'm a big PGA Tour fan, a big golf fan, and the one thing that golf fans want more of are mic'd players. They want to hear that. They don't want to hear like trash talk and stuff like that. A lot of golf fans just want to hear the way the golfer is talking to his caddy about, strategy, read the putt, what are you trying to do here? That's what the typical golf fan wants. But invariably, when you have the mic player, you have, F word this and blah, blah, blah that. And it happened last weekend, like right at the beginning of the tournament, which, some of you don't care about. But for the TV, they're trying to protect that kind of stuff. So one way or another, whether it be stadiums pumping in noise, what we typically do with music, or TV kind of pumping in their own noise. You've heard the NFL teams talk about, simulated crowd noise, things like that. They are going to try to do something to obscure the natural sound coming from the players and the coaches talking, because in an empty stadium, those, they call them parabola mics. They're kind of like half moon shaped microphones. In an empty stadium, those microphones are pretty sensitive. So they're going to try to do something to protect against that. All right, a couple more things. John Adams talking about the SEC network team changes. Yeah, I said before, I think Marcus Spears is good at his job, and I think it's very weird that ESPN, when they find someone who's good at their job, they very quickly try to find a different job for them. Really, Laura Rutledge is kind of the same way. She's been moved off of the college football stuff, moved on to other things, because somehow when you're good at a job, they got to find a different job for you. And a lot of these changes for the people who've been changed, and not necessarily changes for the better. Joe Tessitore, very much the same way. Tessitore was a beloved figure in college football, resoundingly rejected as the host of Monday Night Football, the play-by-play voice of Monday Night Football. Another example of, listen, moving someone onto a different job is not necessarily a change for the better. All right, we've really got to go. This is late. Memphis Dog says hopefully 2 W's against Bama this year. Yeah, you and me both. Memphis on that. Jacob O'Neill asks if Paul Feinbaum leaving. Not leaving his regular show for now, but just reportedly, according to the New York Post, not going to be a part of SEC Nation anymore. Which I guess also means Feinbaum won't be doing a show on Friday from the SEC Nation game either. But that's just a guess on my part. All right, let's get ready to go. Jay Shipe says college game day with a remote broadcast from their house. I haven't heard much about that. Is that talk out there? I've not really heard that. Either way, we're going to go for now. Thank you for being here, part of the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Don't forget to check out AJC.com for your Atlanta news now. Stay up to date on everything going on in the in our world, in our city. AJC news, providing that for you at AJC.com. Obviously, a lot of very tough, very serious situations going on in our city. You want to be up to date on what's going on with that, you can check that out at AJC.com. I mentioned before about the potential changes to some of the names on the buildings as a part of the institutions that are part of the University System of Georgia. You can read more details on that at AJC.com there as well. And some fun stuff there too. So you can kind of cover all of that. Atlanta News Now at AJC.com. Make sure you check that out. Also, thanks for being a part of the R.S. Andrews Cool Down today. Check them out online at rsandrews.com. Stay up to date and make sure your air conditioning system is up to date. Your water heater, if it goes out, in many cases, they can replace that for you the same day. Plumbing issue, obviously you're in an emergency situation, then we'll call people that story after story have been delivering smiles. That's what R.S. Andrews will do for you. Find them online at rsandrews.com. Have a great day, folks. Thanks for being with us. Huge thanks to Meriwether and Tharp for making DawgNation Daily possible as well. We'll see you again tomorrow at 10 a.m. For more DawgNation videos, check out youtube.com/DawgNation.